Hey everyone, just giving a little content warning here. During this episode, we do mention themes of self-harm and violence, so please keep that in mind while listening. Thank you.
It was a creepy, stormy day. When we see space.
Hello everyone, my name is
We got all the time
Julian
left.
Harper. Welcome back to Art is the Tool, our podcast about art, disability, and other stuff. I am joined by my amazing co-hosts and co-workers. We've got Adrienne, Beckham.
Hello.
We've got Alasia, Destine-Defreece.
Hi.
And we've got Maggie, Brennan.
Hey.
I only know them a lot.
No worries.
We just wanted to chat a little bit about artwork that is inaccessible. We don't get to talk a lot about artwork itself and what helps make it accessible, and today what doesn't. So we're going to get into it. And I think we're going to start with an artwork that Maggie had looked into.
For those who maybe haven't listened to the previous episode, I'm the theater person. In this room, at least. There's several people in the organization who also are. But when this topic was posed, I was kind of like, oh, well, the only things that I can think of are like performance-based. And I was pondering, and then it occurred to me that I knew exactly what I wanted to talk about. So I studied abroad when I was in undergrad, and I studied in Dublin, Ireland. And at the school I was at, we were seeing performances every week of like professional theater in our city. And one day they said, okay, everybody, tonight we are seeing a one-person show. It will be at the school, like the artist came to the school and like set up shop and all that kind of stuff. So we went through our day of classes and then reported back to the school to see this performance. And to my knowledge, if I'm remembering correctly, the things that I knew about this performance going into it were that it was called Iscariot, and it was a one-person show. And that's what I knew. So we all pile into this room, and we're ready to go for this like about hour, maybe a little over an hour long performance. And there were so many things that I saw in that performance that I simply was not prepared for. In terms of like, not just like what was talked about, and what the play addressed, but like physical things that I watched that I was like, oh, I would have liked to have had some kind of content warning about like physical violence or like, you know, just generally like body awareness or I don't know. And there was a talk back after the show. I don't know if I want to like, should I be like, this is like an example of a thing that I saw, like,
Yeah, I mean, we can also...
I can say like trigger warning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like that's what I would have liked to have had. Did not get that, but trigger warning, self-harm. And this person in the course of the play like had a whip and was like whipping themselves, and then also like at one point appeared to stick a fork into his hand. Like it was a whole lot of just like really intense stuff. And a lot of us after the show, when it was the talk back, a lot of us who we were all, for the most part, this was a group of American students. So we were all like, hey, why no trigger warnings? Like, do y'all know about that? And it started a conversation, not just with this artist, but then the next day in our first class of the day, like we were all still kind of like reeling. So our professor was like, oi, what's going on? And, or whatever, in his Irish accent. And we were like, I need more time to process this. because that was a lot. And the show also dealt a lot with religious trauma, and it was kind of like apparent about, like, it was apparent about halfway through the show that we were all like bearing witness to this person's experience in a very, like, in a way that felt just a little bit unsafe, not just for the people watching it, but also for the person doing it. So we ended up having many, many conversations with the folks who were running the program about, like, what are trigger warnings? Why do we have them in America? And it's not to say that they don't exist in theater in Ireland. Like, please, obviously, like, don't take this one experience as, like, what it's like to see theater abroad. But in, like, it was just, like, kind of bonkers bananas. And we had all, I think at this point, it was like 3 weeks into the program. So we were all, like, we were a pretty tight-knit group. And, yeah. Yeah. That's kind of it.
Yeah. So, to me, it sounds like there's, like, a couple of things at play.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's, like, some of the, like, programmatic stuff, like, you know, working with the audience, prepping them with different materials, and having that kind of, like, emotional context. But then, like, there feels like, what am I trying to say? Like, I'm getting there. Like,
You're good.
what is the moral obligation of the artist? And, like, and I feel like, and this brings me back to grad school and conversations, like with, like, angsty performance artists and as a, like, person who's dealt with religious things myself, explicitly through art and performance art, like, what you're often told that you really don't have, like, you kind of establish your own sense of ethical responsibility as an artist. And I feel like there's a little bit of that, like, at least my understanding in my education, that, like, that's kind of how it's taught, like, that, like, that we are always kind of rubbing against the boundaries, like, we're always getting up to the edge of, like, what is, like, of people's comfort level, and that like, that is some people view that as their jobs as artists. And so, like, I feel like there's, like, some of that, like, training, some of that, like, and also maybe, like, mythology as, like, an artist, like you kind of view yourself as, like, this person who, like, goes in and, like, is, like, breaking down boundaries and like exploring the taboo and, like, going places other people won't go. And, like,
and even from a theater lens, like, I've had conversations with people when I was in college about, like, trigger warnings or content warnings and, like, what should be included and what shouldn't be included. And a lot of people early on in those conversations would start from the angle of, well, we can't, like, say that there's a trigger warning for gun violence because that's the twist. Is that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it was like, okay, well, what if we write a better twist? But also, like,
surprise.
Like, well, there's that. But, like, you know, at what point do you then, like, you know, as an audience goer, like, that's in effect, like, I don't know. It starts to, like, become like the people who are producing the show, or like the show is like, you know, not for people who might have, you know what I mean? Like it starts to like really alienate people based on their experiences, which is like kind of the antithesis, I would like to think, of art. Art is supposed to be like the mouthpiece for various experiences and identities and all of that. So yeah. it was just, and we had that when we were in the talk back, like the guy was like saying like, well, the reason that I didn't have a content warning was because, like, you know, I wanted the audience to like be in the moment and to be like really like, you know, watching presently and be really connected. And it's like, well, I don't know. Like I think about half of that performance with my eyes closed, and I wanted to plug my ears, but I didn't want the people around me to be like, what's she doing? You know, like it was like, I don't know.
Also, I feel like that's a weird answer to that, because if you present somebody with a potentially triggering experience, then they're not present. They're thinking about their own safety and themselves, and it could very well take them back to a place that they don't want to be, and then they're not watching your show at all. They're thinking about their experience and potentially having a very not fun time, to put it mildly.
No, I spent a lot of the performance as well thinking about my peers and being like, I really hope that like my bestie in the back row is doing okay, you know? Because like it was just like, it was kind of just like so unsettling, it was unproductive. And like the conversation became just about like, not about the larger themes of the work that were present, and like I'm sure if I had read this on paper I could be like, oh, like I see like action imitating like whatever, but like when you're like physically seeing it, it's like, no, like all of my processing of this is going to be done like out of like the environment, like out of the space. Like I'm gonna go home and cool down, and maybe in a week I will be able to like think about this. You know what I mean? Yeah. Which is, I guess, fair. I don't.
Well, I do wonder if that response that a lot of artists seem to have when critics are saying something about their work, that idea that the integrity of the art is above all else, and that the art, it only works if I perform it this way without a warning, or if I put it in this place despite anything else about, you know, the people who are already in that space. And so I don't know, I'm just like, what if this artist was challenged to think more about how people could feel safe watching this performance while still getting those larger themes out? Like, is there a middle ground? And does it always have to be that finding a middle ground, quote unquote, like ruins the art? Because I feel like that's a conversation that comes up a lot, is like, oh, well, this wasn't my original intention as the artist. I wanted it to be this way. And by doing anything else to make the art more palatable, or in some ways just straight up more enjoyable for the audience, that is ruining the piece.
Yeah, I also feel like and like I say this kind of also as a dig at myself, because I'm like a writer, so like I write, but like there's a lot of ego involved in that like experience too, and I think there's like, it's almost like the audacity an artist can have to assume that they can control how a work sort of moves through a person. So it's like to your example of like the twist of gun violence and not wanting to include a trigger warning, it's like, well, bold of you to assume that a person's not going to be able to just guess the twist anyway.
It's like, give the audience some credit.
The audience is smart, and the audience has autonomy and free will and free thought, and will not behave in the way that you anticipate no matter what. So like, let's maybe think about how we can create art that allows for that, as opposed to trying to be so rigid and preserve this sort of like quote unquote integrity of the word, when really it's like, no, you're just trying to play God in your little like world that you've created. And again, like, I'm a writer, I write stories, and I very much do that myself sometimes, but like there is an element of like, when you're creating something for consumption to like a larger audience, like at some point you have to pause and say, and like this is a bit of a cliche kind of thing to say, but like, this work is not mine. Like, it does not exist the way that I like demand it exists, in the way that it then hits the audience and like changes.
I feel like maybe that's a good point to move towards the piece that Alasia, that you were thinking about.
I did want to say, I've just been sitting here thinking about theater, performance art, and connecting it to some of what I learned in doing theater things in undergrad, and this is all very theater of cruelty, in which I'm like, to me, I'm blaming theater of cruelty. I am blaming Antonin Artaud. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. But I say it's his fault for saying, what if we revealed mankind to himself by being evil to him on stage? And that's such an interesting concept, but a weird concept to be like, the point is to like assault the senses. We are going to make people feel scared and uncomfortable, and that is the art. So I'm like, I can see why someone would be like, I would never do a trigger warning, because then how can I properly freak people out? But it makes me question, like, and this is maybe, I think this is where it gets, it's super subjective. It gets down to my own personal thoughts about art, and my goal in making art and engaging with art is not to be physically uncomfortable or feeling mentally unsafe. I do think that there is merit in talking about social movements or issues in the world that might make you uncomfortable. So like, sometimes people are uncomfortable talking about class. Sometimes people are uncomfortable talking about race. I think there were some amazing gay artists who made works that focused on AIDS in their communities, and that made people uncomfortable in a way that I'm like, yes, that is a way that you are talking about your experiences, marginalized, whatnot, that isn't necessarily harming the audience. And I'm like, so my take is like, I'm just like, some of that art to me is bad, and I think part of this episode is about being a hater. And I'm a hater, and I don't like the idea that the art is just to make people feel not good.
I feel that. I also think it's one of those things, at least like personally, I'm just like, if you're going to make that kind of art, I can't stop you. Live your life. That's all good. But
I'm just gonna hate it.
Allow people to make the choice to engage in that space. Like, it goes back to trigger warnings. Like, allow a person to make that decision that they're consenting to have this experience.
And it goes back to autonomy.
It's like, at the end of the day, look, I don't mind like reading or experiencing a piece of art that's going to make me uncomfortable. Like, I would appreciate if it had a point, but I personally, I all well and good, but I want to do it at a time where I feel open to that. Like, it's not something that I would like sprung upon me. And I think,
totally. No, like, I think one of the first conversations that I had with like my friends while we were walking home from that experience was like, I would probably be feeling so much differently, and I would be having different thoughts about what I just saw if I had known some things prior. Like, I maybe would have been able to, like, engage with the themes or whatever, like, in a more, like, productive and, like, artist, like, unpacking the thing way. Because, like, we're all students, we're all trying to go there to learn, but it's also, like, I don't know, like, I had to, like, call my girlfriend after that and be like, hey, like, I'm having a time, like, we're all having a time, like, that was crazy. Yeah, and it's also, it's like, of course there's, like, everything is, or not everything, but, like, there's room for subjectivity, there's room for, like, brutalist and, well, I guess not brutalist, sorry, theater of cruelty, there's room for, like, all of these spheres, but at a certain point too, it, like, on the topic of accessibility, does become, like, extremely alienating, and extremely, like, exclusionary. So
yeah, I think definitely for me, at least, bottom line is, like, is there a point? If there is a point, I'm more willing to accept this. And then, do I get a choice in when I'm, you know, in engaging with the art at all, when I'm engaging, how I'm engaging? Do I get a choice in that, or is it just being thrust upon me? And I will use that to segue into Tilted Arc by one Richard Serra, because while, look, I took art classes, I took art history classes, I can definitely talk about the why behind it, but I think that the why is bad, and that makes me a hater, and I think that's okay. So if you don't know, Tilted Arc was displayed in Foley Federal Plaza in Manhattan. It was put up in 1981, and yay, to me, a hater, taken down in 1989.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was up for
That's longer. A long time.
Yeah, longer than I thought.
Sheesh.
It's 120 feet long and 12 feet high. It's completely solid, and it's raw steel. And so it's like it's an unfinished rust plate essentially, so that over time it, like, self-oxidizes and, like, don't quote me on the science, but basically it looks more rusty as time goes on, and that's also part of the art. I bring this up because I think it is ridiculous to put a 120 foot long, 12 foot high piece of steel in a high traffic area. Again, this was displayed in Foley Federal Plaza in Manhattan. There are office buildings around, and so when it was put up, a lot of the people who work in that area were, quite frankly, pissed off. They were like, what the hell is this giant ass piece of metal doing here? And it's metal that it's a sculpture. Yes, it's public artwork. Yes, the government, you know, was like, we give you money to put this up, Richard Serra. So technically he no longer owned it, but the whole point was to kind of be a barrier in a way. Like, that sculpture, part of what he was doing, part of what Serra was doing, was, like, putting this piece in a very specific place that was high traffic because of the context of where it was. That was important as well, which is why it is a very, quote-unquote, important piece of site-specific art. But it literally got in the way of people's, like, commutes to work, just because you have to, you know, you're walking maybe in the middle, and now you got to go, like, all the way around this giant thing. It provided no seating for anybody who was out there. And if anything, it just made people's work days a little bit more difficult, which is what a lot of people complained about. It also reminds me of the type of architecture that tries to prevent unhoused people from, like, sitting somewhere. It gives me that as well.
Yeah, like hostile architecture.
Yes, exactly. So it's very hostile architecture to me. I know it's technically sculpture, so it's like, what's architecture, what's sculpture, blah, 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 that whole discussion. But at the end of the day, I'm like, this man said a lot of people walk through this space. I'm going to put a giant piece of metal up. Imagine someone who has, I don't know, difficulties walking long distances. Now they have to go all around this large structure. There are ways, I think, that Richard Serra, again, I'm a hater, so I'm going to just say this, could have made this work better and more interactive in ways that some of his other work is. For example, I don't know, putting little arches inside of the piece so people can still walk through, so that people using mobility devices can still get through, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's just a giant piece of metal that blocked everyone's path. So I'm like, there's not a ton of nuance that I'm giving you here. I'm like very much talking about physical accessibility and how putting this in a high traffic area where people are working is just inaccessible for people who have disabilities, for people who don't have disabilities, for people who have invisible disabilities, for people who have visible disabilities. It just is a bad time for everyone except the artists who are like, I get it. It's site specific.
Also, like 9 years is wild.
Yeah.
It was 9 years of arguing. To be clear, it was 9 years of making a petition, 9 years of taking Sarah taking the government to court. Oh, wow. There was a trial. So he complained against the United States General Services Office because they had violated the oral agreement he had not to remove the sculpture from that space. And so basically now the sculpture is in, I want to say it's in like, I don't know, maybe Maryland, DC or something. I don't really know. But it's in 3 pieces and it's taken down and it will never go back up because Richard Serra said, unless it goes here, it can't go anywhere.
There's been kind of a theme of like consent and consent as material for the artist. Is something that the artist can play with as an idea. In my education, I know a lot of other people's education, you're encouraged to engage with those kinds of ideas, and that like most people have lots of critiques of these like older make big stuff and put them places, white guys, and like and this is definitely like a mood in art history. We were just talking about like land art. People literally just going to the desert and digging big giant square holes you have to drive 4 hours out to, and like there's like the pairing of a kind of physical inaccessibility, but also the theory behind the artwork or the idea behind the artwork. At least this is how I felt, like that you had to hold a certain air of mystery with your art in order for it to be understood in a certain way, or as like art with a capital A. Art that is engaging with this like history, with this lineage, and so you have to make sure that it is such a unique and totally new experience, and an experience that isn't tainted by anything else, that is that is essentialized, that is anything that isn't the idea is removed. And like very like modernist, very like Clement Greenberg, very much like it is as much itself as it is. And so anything that is inessential, whether that be captions, whether that be chairs, whether that be like wall text, is removed. I can feel just how these things are connected, how the physical inaccessibility is informed by the way that artists are taught to imagine themselves, and as like pontificators instead of like, I don't know, community members or like, I don't know, friends. Like imagine if you're taught in art school to like, I don't know, be a friend and engage. Whoa. You can engage with difficult ideas and like engage with like politics and all the stuff that we're talking about, pain, violence, but like from the perspective of friendship. I know that sounds like I don't know, woo woo, but like
I like it. Theater of the friend.
Yeah. Well, it's also, like, especially from, like, performance art and theater, like, if, now we're going to get into, like, what if there was no audience? Like, if you don't, like, specifically with theater, like, if no one's watching the thing, that's just a rehearsal, you know? Like, it's, like, and it's still art or whatever, but, like, if...
It requires engagement.
It requires engagement.
I mean, so does this piece, this Richard Serra piece. If I may share a quote that he said about it. He says about this piece, the viewer becomes aware of himself and his movement through the plaza. As he moves, the sculpture changes. Contraction and expansion of the sculpture result from the viewer's movement. Step by step, the perception not only of the sculpture, but of the entire environment changes. Which is why he's like, it has to be here specifically, site specific. But I wanted to bring up this quote just so that we all knew what he was thinking, and to confirm that he wants the piece to be engaged with by moving around it. But I think that, but I think it's interesting that part of his, initial idea is including this movement. And a lot of the critiques about it are about how it's ugly, about how it's just kind of like ridiculous that it exists where it exists. And I just want to put on the table that we can definitely, from accessibility standpoint, argue against that very idea itself, where the way to engage with it is through movement through the plaza, but you're making it more difficult to move through the plaza.
Yeah. Put it anywhere else and people can still move around it. Sorry.
I keep talking so much, but like
you should.
I think about like I just want to like I remember I'm thinking about my professor, and they're like, you know what the point of grad school is to essentially like eliminate like your sense of taste.
Oh,
like your individual like sense of like taste in art, like and to engage with art not in terms of its like your immediate like or dislike, but of the main elements. And so I feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like you are just, I feel like as an art person, you are in this space, you're in this mindset. Like one of my main issues with the work is that people can choose to be put into a difficult situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like and that, I think that's actually fine.
Yeah.
And if you let them know this is like uncomfortable, it's going to take a long time, you're going to walk around all this whole thing. You learn who is meant to be in the space by looking at the space.
And he just took a space that a lot of people are meant to be in. A lot of people are going to their offices
like
to
they are
work.
contractually obligated to be in that space, like literally. And
he said, this space is no longer for you. It's actually for Tilted Arc.
Yeah. And in a way I feel like we're again getting at that this argument that any frustration that someone might have with some of these artworks is like the inability to deal with the raw difficulty of the idea. Like it is a tool used to dismiss legitimate arguments.
I mean, that's what happened there was a public hearing in 1985. Again, this one up in 81. And like what you're saying, Julian, is like quite literally what happened. 122 people testified in favor of keeping it, and only 58 testified in favor of removing it. But worth noting is that the people arguing in favor of it included Philip Glass, Keith Haring, different artists, historians, a psychiatrist, and they were all like, well, you see, you have to understand the art and that humankind, blah, blah, blah. And it's, we're artists. We came up with this idea. We understand it. We know what Sarah's doing because we get it. And then the local workers were the people who were arguing for removal, the people who were affected by it in their day-to-day life, who did not consent to having a piece of art that acted as a structural barrier to their days, just plopped there. Plop art, forgot to mention that for you, Julian. Plop art and plonk art is also what we can refer to some of these more site-specific works as, but the ones that are in like corporate or like government plazas. But yeah, I mean, when you have a piece of paper and it says the artists and the people who are making a lot of money like this, and the other paper says the people who are working 9-to-5 jobs in these office spaces don't like this.
And what's wild to me is like, you know, the artists, they like say, oh, you don't understand this idea, but like the reality is the idea that this piece, at least in my mind, is trying to like convey is an idea that like the people that are advocating against it are very, very well aware of. Like they probably understand the idea more intimately than the artists themselves, because it's their life.
If the idea is to engage with it, they're doing it every day whether they want to or not. Therefore, they get it.
Yeah.
It's like, I understand.
I mean, it feels like we're dancing around maybe a kind of privilege, like the material is privilege, and like they get to wield it wherever. Right. And that becomes like the material, and like, you know, even outside of accessibility, a state of mind of, I think, many artists, especially famous ones, and how they been taught to not interact with the audience, that they talk about having a conversation through their artwork. But it's untrue. It's an artwork. It doesn't speak to them. It doesn't communicate. It's just there, and it's a command and not a conversation.
It's a weird show of power.
Yeah, totally.
And when we talk about art spaces and art being elitist, this also, I think this fits into that as well, because we've been talking about that, like, who can talk about it, who gets it, who doesn't get it. And like talking about accessibility in the art world is not just making ticketing easier and removing financial barriers and ensuring that people can physically get inside the space, but I also think it's allowing the people who are coming to engage with the art to feel like they have everything they need to engage with the art, and not feel like they had to have gone to some art school to get it, or some art school to, you know, fight on the correct side of whether or not to take down a sculpture. And it's like, is it accessible in the sense that we are giving it to everyone? Is it accessible in the sense that you walk into a gallery space maybe and feel as though you were invited to engage with the art, and not feel as though you're being told you wouldn't get it because you don't have some scholastic, you know, like prizes in art or something.
And from an artist's perspective, if you are like, if you are making something and not considering that, why? Yeah. Why not? You know? And like, okay, like you're making the choice, but like, have you like really like unpacked why that is like what your like thought pattern is, or what your like, I don't know, why that choice? Yeah. Why this now?
Also, like, it's like, why that choice, and like, why choose to make publicly consumed art? Because like, you can create art for yourself.
Richard Serra could have put that in his backyard.
Yeah, and I think he should have. He should have.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to get to your kitchen?
Yeah.
But you have to go 120 feet around this large
thing. When you have
thing
friends over for dinner, you can be like, yo, check out the backyard. Like, what's
do you understand the point? Because I do. That's why it's in my house.
But I love that question of, why do you choose to do this and not that, Maggie? Because I'm imagining Julian going with his experience in video art and going up to different contemporary artists being like, hey, I noticed you didn't put any captions in this video. Why? And they're like, oh, it's not really the aesthetic. And Julian's like, you don't want people who are, I don't know, deaf or hard of hearing to be able to read the screen, or anyone who might benefit from captions. And they're like, no. Like, imagine having that conversation with someone and laying it on the table and saying, oh, do you not want these people to be able to access your work? And imagine an artist being like, oh, no, I don't want them to.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this maybe gets into like a last point, which is that I think we need to rethink how we teach artists. And I think we also need to rethink in the art space who our obligations are towards. And I think that, I mean, it doesn't help that, like, you know, art spaces are run and funded how they are. And so, like, the obligation becomes to whoever's collecting the art, and so that becomes a complication in something like video art, where it's about like creating this prestige is like the same as like a painting. And so if all of the best art that all the best collectors want aren't captioned, and that they build into their contracts that you can't alter the work in any particular way, any fundamental way, then like and then all of the museums essentially are like, okay. And so they, you know, because they're legally required to actually do the thing. So we have a system that, like, you know, reinforces these ableist structures because there's like there's a value to how these things are presented. And that, you know, that's like, you know, video art, for instance. But I think that, like, I think it's okay for us to demand a little bit more from our artists. And I think that, like, arts institutions, and this is just me speaking offhand, but I'm pretty sure that, like, arts institutions are a little bit, that they really see themselves, you know, they don't want to control the art for good reason. They don't want to shift the culture makers. They want to be a platform for them. But I think that what sometimes we can see is that I think this is one space where artists are behind, especially in visual art. And I think that they're like been taught to engage with the audience like students. Like that you have to learn the work and you have to understand the work. You have to read about it. You have to or that, like, you have to understand this experience as, like, completely as itself. And so if you are confused or if you don't understand, that is the experience. And it becomes like you have to engage on these specific terms the artist stipulates or doesn't stipulate, and that, like, that and that we can demand from our artists maybe a collective framework, like a framework that envisions communities, that the artwork is something that they build in connection with people, and that they actually want people to have the physical space to engage with.
Julian, can I pose a question for you?
100%.
Oh, yes, here we go. So I like everything you said. I like the idea of this framework. I like the idea of teaching artists to think about creating differently, perhaps, and for these audiences. My question is, with the work that we're doing at Artreach, because we work so directly oftentimes with institutions, so the theaters, the museums, the galleries, especially in light of, like, Project 76, for example, where we're going to be doing more of those accessibility reports, and helping places improve their accessibility services and offerings, while not necessarily changing the artwork itself, because as you said, we don't have the authority to do that. The institution usually doesn't have the authority to do that unless they commission the artwork from the artist. But do you foresee, like, this work that we're doing influencing artists to start considering, you know, these new ways to create, or like these new frameworks to consider while creating art? Or do you think that's going to have to come mostly internally from these institutions, these art schools, where the artists are really first coming into themselves as people who are creating art with this academic background? So I guess, does it start there? Does it, I don't know if it starts necessarily with the work we're doing or not, but like, I'm just wondering, how does the work we do at Artreach directly interact with how you see artists soon being able to consider accessibility and moving away from ableist practices?
I think that's a really good question, and I'm not like I'm just
like,
me.
you have to answer this, Julian.
I'm just a little guy. I have been thinking about this a lot, and I think that one, I do think there needs to be fundamental curriculum changes to like how we teach higher ed and all the arts. Like, fundamentally, like I didn't learn a lick about accessibility in my entire education, from undergrad to grad school, and that I think it is super important, and I think it's great that that museums are legally liable. I don't want to remove that. It's like, yes, and let's hold them accountable.
Yeah.
But that, I want to hold artists to the same standards that I think that they envision themselves as wanting to be inclusive. I think most artists want people to see their work. I think most artists want to be engaging in this particular way. And I think artists and art institutions have a particular ability to use the language of inclusivity and to use the language of diversity for their own means and for their own, like, power. And so I think we need to hold, you know, all of these different spaces, the academic space, you know, the artists in the studio, the museums, the galleries, the theaters, you know, we need to hold everyone to a higher standard. And I think that there should maybe be a little bit more pressure on the artist specifically, is that I think in so many other spaces artists are on the forefront. Like, artists are kind of pushing ahead in terms of like in terms of like pushing forth particular values and pushing forth like new ideas. And I feel like it's really silly for this not to be one of those things. And like, you know, there are artists already, like people who do accessibility work often talk about Carolyn Woolard, Carolyn Lazard. Carolyn Woolard is another artist that I think is really great, but Carolyn Lazard, and they just recently here in Philly made like these artworks that essentially, you know, forced the museum to like have more accessible practices. And you know, imagine that, you know, artists that, you know, hold the museum to a particular standard, and that is the work. The work is accessible, like that. Like, that's part of the content. why can't that be the case? And so, and conversely, like imagine a museum that stipulates that if you want to exhibit in this space, these are the requirements.
Yeah.
And we will hold steadfast to these things.
They can really do that. That's the funniest part, is that,
Yeah.
like, places can make decisions.
Yeah.
Places can make things more accessible. Artists can make institutions be more accessible if that's what their work calls for.
Totally.
Wild.
I also think artists have the power of creating DIY spaces, and DIY spaces can also influence and inform the larger, like, current of how the art industry changes.
Totally.
That's true in Slay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think about my experience getting my like theater performance degree, and a lot of the like really positive accessibility changes that happened while I was in school were largely student driven. It was students going to the teachers and being like, "Hey, can we talk about what intimacy coordination is in working on productions, and like what situations call for intimacy coordination that aren't just like staging a kiss?" Like really like reframing like how broad that scope can be is something that I think is very much like kind of like a ongoing like flow of like not only like the students that are also contributing to it, but also like I had a lot of like really awesome faculty members that were like, "Hey, out in the industry, this is what's best practice, so we're implementing it in school." Like, and I think that there should be, I don't know, speaking from my performance perspective, but I think there should be more of that, you know.
Yeah, totry.
More of that, less Richard Serra.
And I don't know if this is true, but I feel like it's shifting. I feel like more and more people are engaging with these particular ideas, and I'm excited.
No, I'm fresh out, and we had there was a lot of conversations throughout my time in school. So
cool. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank everyone for listening, for participating, for talking. This has been Artreach and Artist's Tool. Yeah.
Catch you on the flip side.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
The music for this podcast was written and performed by Carl Trunk from Pop 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 Records. You can check out that song and other Pop 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 Records songs on their Bandcamp.